I will start from a very broad discussion that I think will orient the rest of the talk. I'll go back to a paper that was published 23 years ago by a sociologist who at the time was interested in understanding how people perceive them as compared to others. Particularly teenagers, they tend to compare themselves with others to determine whether they are adequate. Turns out that if we could count the number of friends that we have, most of us would conclude that we are not adequate because our friends tend to have more friends than we have. And the reason is statistical. People that have many social ties, they are counted multiple times when we are doing averages over a social group. That any closed social group will have this property, that the mean number of friends is always larger or equal than the mean number of friends. Okay. The equality here holds only in the very stage having the exact same number of friends. Okay. It's the same argument that tends to overestimate the number of people in the beaches if you ask people that have been in the beach to report how many people were there, because the beaches that had more people will be reported more often. But this is not a curiosity. Actually, this has very serious implications for a number of processes on networks. Just to give you an example, imagine that you have a disease spreading in a network, and you are allowed to immunize a number of people, but a finite number of them. So a strategy that you might want to adopt is to immunize people at random. But this suggests a better method. You could select people at random and then immunize an acquaintance of those people. Okay? This has in fact been done in an experiment run by Christakis and Fowler. They used the number of a few hundred students from Harvard, selected in a more or less random way, and they asked those students to name one of their friends. So they created two groups with that, the group of the students and the group of the friends. And they followed the evolution of H1N1 in 2009, and they noticed that the number of cases peaked about 2 weeks earlier in the group of friends. So this tells you that this very property can be used not only to come up with better ways to control the spread of disease, but also for the early detection of outbreaks. So the question that follows is, well, this entire discussion here, in this example, is based on structural properties of the network. Can we generalize this to other problems? Can we address other network problems based entirely on the network property, on the structural properties of the network? Just to give you a clue to what the answer would be, I will discuss another very simple example here. This is an example in which the dynamics comes into play in a more direct way. It's a very small food web in the Channel Islands in California. This is an important case study because these islands, they have a unique species of fox, the island fox, that was used to live there unthreatened until 150 years ago when feral pigs were introduced by humans. So at the time, this was not thought to be a problem because the pigs do not directly, but the pigs attracted eagles, and eagles that would occasionally go to the colonize the island, reproducing the island because of the abundance of pigs to eat. Occasionally, they would also eat foxes, though. And that occasional interaction with foxes caused the fox to get very close to extinction. So here's a problem in which you have more than a structure. Because, first, you cannot simply undo what you did in the first place. If you remove the pigs now, the foxes, the eagles will eat all the foxes. They would just shift their feeding habits. At the same time, you cannot kill the eagles. They are protected. So it's a challenging problem. It was solved after many years of effort in which modeling was used to to orient the removal of these two species simultaneously. Okay, so this is a problem in which we have only 3 nodes. This is, I guess, the smallest system in which you can say you have a network. And yet, it's a difficult control problem to deal with. Networks that now network scientists are interested in, they are bigger than that. Usually they have hundreds, sometimes, like in the case of food webs, sometimes in the case of neuronal networks. Here we are talking about 10 to 11 nodes and about 10,000 more connections. So we are talking about very large scale systems. Other examples, intracellular. I will be revisiting this example later. The figure that I'm showing here is a generic representation of a metabolic network. In comparison with the previous image, this is a relatively simple network, has just a few thousand chemical reactions and a comparable but smaller number of compounds, but still, it's not the type of network that you can understand by naked eye. It's becoming increasingly more timely to talk about them, particularly power grid networks, now that they are going from analog to digital, and the idea of a smart grid is materializing. So all these networks, they are very large. They have non-trivial dynamics, and they are networks that we would like to be able to control to a certain extent. That one can ask is whether we can, based entirely on the structure of the network, like in the Friend's paradox example, draw conclusions about how to control these networks. And my answer is no, you cannot. And the reason is because most of these networks, they have not only complex structural properties, but also, okay, so they have what physicists would call phase space phenomena. Okay, you have things that you can only understand if you account for the phase space dynamics. And what is, I'm listing here some of the main things. Most people working in networks will tell you that networks from completely different fields have common structural properties. They might have comparable distribution of number of connections per node. They might have comparable average distance between nodes and so on and so forth. But they also have many dynamical properties in common, and I'm listing some of them here. The dynamics of all the networks I showed you here is nonlinear. Okay. One of the implications of the dynamics being nonlinear is that the network can be multi-stable, can have stable states, and more than one of them can have attractors in general that are even more general than fixed point stable states. These systems, in general, they are also described by a very large number of variables. Even in the case in which you have just one variable describing each node or link, if the network has many of them, it will be it will lead to a very high dimensional state space. And here is something that's still very widely unappreciated. Networks tend to respond in a decentralized way to perturbations. This is definitely true for natural networks, but also for engineered networks. That's the main reason why we have large blackouts in the power grid. You have a perturbation at a point. That perturbation causes some damage, but that damage by itself is not significant. What becomes significant is the amplification of that damage as it propagates through the network. And the reason why you have this type of amplification is largely because the system responds in a suboptimal way in the first place. So now when you want them to intervene in systems like this, whether it is because you want to keep the system stable and operational in the case of an infrastructure system, or because you want to identify drug targets in the case of a biological network, one problem that you will face is that there are constraints on the possible interventions that you can implement. Okay? This can be physical constraints, biological constraints. You cannot always go there and change the state of each node in the network. You'll be able to change the state of some of them with the hope that will perhaps influence the others. Okay? And even for those you can change in very constrained ways in general. Okay? So this is the scenario in which I will be discussing problems in this talk. To be more concrete, let me go back to that example of metabolic networks. Here is a simplified view. Inside a cell, you have the genes. They are coding proteins, and some of those proteins are enzymes. They facilitate, catalyze chemical reactions involving small molecules. Those chemical reactions all together form what we call the metabolic network. These reactions in the metabolic networks, they are usually not spontaneous. So if you don't have enzymes, they will be running at a very small rate or be inactive. So this gives you then a way to manipulate this network by manipulating the activity of the genes, which can be done biochemically. And the question that I asked myself years ago was, well, suppose that you have a disease that causes one of these genes not to be functional. So the corresponding reaction is not going to be active. What can you do to mitigate the loss of biological function that would lead to? Imagine, for example, you have a bacteria, E. coli, for example. If you knock out a gene, usually one of two things will happen. Either it will have no effect because that gene was not essential, or it will reduce the growth rate, the ability of the organism to reproduce. If you are a gene therapist, maybe you say, oh, one way to mitigate that damage is by creating a copy of that gene, a healthy copy of it in a plasmid, and introducing it to the cell with the hope that it will do the same as the original one. And sometimes that works, but there are issues both with delivery and with the fact that that gene will no longer be in the DNA, and DNA regulates itself, so that's a problem. We therefore try to study this problem by looking at the network that's already available here to see whether there are other things we can do. And it turns out that the best thing you can do in general is to inactivate other reactions that are competing for the same resources. Okay? So you can have a situation in which the knockout of that gene is lethal or nearly lethal, but when you knock out this other one here, this cell is able to reproduce again. So this, when we discovered this, we thought was important. So we gave it a name. We called it synthetic recovery. So just to be clear, it's in which one perturbation is lethal, but that combined with another one is no longer lethal, even though each one of them in isolation is deleterious. So just to be clear, this is happening precisely because this network responds in a suboptimal way. The simulation is based on the entire metabolism, but here I'm showing just a little piece of the TCA cycle so we can understand what's going on. This part of the metabolic network is producing these three guys here who are building blocks of the biomass, which is needed for the cell to reproduce. If you inactivate this gene, what happens is that the fluxes, the metabolic fluxes leading to those compounds go down to zero. Okay? But that's not the best that the cell could do. That's the spontaneous response of the cell to that perturbation. The best that the cell could do is shown here, in which those the rates of production of those chemicals is not as necessarily as high as initially, but it's close to it. Okay? So if you want to influence this response now with a human intervention, one way would be to look for the difference between them and try to minimize those differences. So you see that this reaction here, this pathway is active here, but would not be active optimally. Same is true for this one. So if you inactivate those guys, even though those are by themselves deleterious interventions, you will actually bring the overall flux distribution to be closer to the optimal one. Okay. This is a a description that can be generalized to many other networks in many other domains. Okay. To give one more motivation to the example I just gave you, the reason why we studied that is, of course, not to save bacteria, is to try to kill them. In fact, years ago, a group from Harvard notes that if you have two antibiotics which combined are weaker than one of them together, than one of them alone, that's to say they interact antagonistically, then cells that have developed resistance to the suppressor of that pair of antibiotics will be killed first. So the idea is that, well, if a cell, let's say that I put two cells at this position in the concentration of those two drugs, but one of them developed resistance to the suppressor, that means that we will actually be effectively at this position, okay, feeling less of the concentration of the suppressor. But the suppressor is precisely reducing the strength of the other antibiotic. So those cells will be in disadvantage. So this observation was important because now you could kill resistant bacteria by using the combination of two antibiotics instead of using only one of them. The only problem is that very few antibiotics have this suppressor partner that can be used to play this game. But this is a problem that can be solved by the synthetic recovery example I gave you earlier, because synthetic rescues, which are shown in this slide here to be comparable with this one, they are precisely the genetic analogs of the antagonistically interacting drugs. So if you identify pairs of genes that interact antagonistically, as in the examples I gave earlier, they will serve as targets for antibiotic drugs that will interact antagonistically. Okay. All right. So if I were to draw a conclusion from this part of my talk, the conclusion would be that, as I hope to be clear to all of you, none of this could be discovered by simple inspection of the network structure. You really have to account for the dynamics, because it is the response of the network to a perturbation that comes into play here. Okay? And that response depends on the dynamics, not on the structure only. So then, a natural question is, to what extent can we actually control the dynamics of complex networks in general? You may think that perhaps this question has already been answered. If we go to the control theory literature, you'll see that one of the very first people to work on control problems from a theoretical perspective was James Maxwell. Same Maxwell that whose name is on the equations of electrodynamics. He worked on the problem of the flying balls control system, governor, which is a system that was used to control steam engines. And he worked on this problem after having worked on the electrodynamic equations. So that says how important he thought this problem was at the time. So he was already very well known for his previous work. And when he worked on this problem, he framed the problem as a problem of stability, okay, which had the advantage of being generalizable to a number of other systems. So this was a while back, as you can see here. And turns out, by the way, Maxwell also worked on network problems of forces. He didn't relate those two things, though, okay? Many people have worked on control problems since, and including control problems that relate to networks. And you'll find actually books written about it. Here are some of the books I like the most. So then the question is, what has been done and what has not been done in this literature? A number of the things that have been addressed in the network context, they are algorithmic, okay? Algorithmic problems in networks, okay? Like, for example, consensus algorithm, okay? Problems that relate, for example, to flocking, herd behavior, and schooling, things like that, okay? Also, a lot has been done in control theory itself that applies to systems with few degrees of freedom, but is not scalable to networks with a large number of nodes. So the answer then to that question is that even though a lot has been done, the problem of large-scale networks, when we try to account for the dynamics, and the dynamics is complex, has been only very, I would say, has been some case studies have been addressed, but in general, this problem remains largely open, okay? Or let's say has remained largely open until, say, a few years ago, when more people from this network community started working on this problem. Example of one contribution that we have made. We have worked on under several different assumptions here, including conditions under which you have no models, no equations describing the system you want to study. But here, for the purpose of this discussion, it will be simpler if we assume that we do know the equations of motion. Okay, we know if you assume that your system is described, for example, by a set of coupled ordinary differential equations. The concept applies in general, but this will facilitate our discussion. So I will assume that regardless of how the equations look like, don't even have to be ordinary differential equations. They could be anything. But I will assume that they have two things in general. They involve dynamical variables that characterize the state of each node or each link in the network, and they have parameters, okay? For example, if we are talking about a food web, the dynamical variables will describe the population of each species. The parameters will describe the mortality rate or growth rate of each species. If we are talking about a metabolic network, the variables will be describing the reaction rates. In the parameters will be the kinetic constants, and so on and so forth. So if you have a situation like that, the system will have stable states in general, because networks have stable states. I will use the letter A to indicate a stable state in this network. So associated to a stable state, you have what we call a Bayesian of attraction. All the states that will eventually converge to that stable state. The neighborhood of that stable state in particular will belong to this Bayesian of attraction, okay? So if you start the system in a random position, we will eventually go to a stable state, okay? So all points that have that property of eventually going to the stable state will define together the Bayesian of attraction of that state, which I will be using omega to denote with an index beta here to indicate the parameters. So the question then is the following. If you have a perturbation that kicks you outside the Bayesian of attraction of the state that you'd like to be in, the desired state, what can you do to bring yourself back? If I put the problem like that, it's trivial. You just perturb the state of the system by a certain amount to go exactly back to the point we were in. The problem is that you in general have constraints. You have equality constraints. For example, there are nodes that you cannot touch, like the example of a protected species. You cannot go there and mess with that species. And you have inequality constraints. For example, if you're trying to control the population of deers, the only one thing that you can do is to reduce the number of males in that population. That's usually the policy. You cannot increase the number of anything else easily to prey on them, okay? So as soon as you have constraints like that, the problem becomes much more complex. And now it is a problem for which no solution existed until recently. here is a typical situation you're in. Suppose that you have, just for the sake of the argument, two variables, and you happen to be in this state at a certain time. You would like to go to this state here, your stable state, the attractor. But let's say that you are allowed only to reduce these variables, not increase them. So you are allowed to move to the left and to the and down. Okay. So can you go to the attractor? Not directly, but maybe indirectly you can, because now you can use the fact that there is this thing called Bayesian of attraction. And maybe the Bayesian of attraction will have a part of it, eligible region of perturbations here. So all you have to do then is to move inside this Bayesian of attraction, and then the system will spontaneously go to that attractor. Okay? That seems trivial, except that we can prove that if you have more than, say, a handful of degrees of freedom, you are not able to calculate the Bayesians of attraction numerically, and analytical methods to estimate them only give you very conservative estimates. Okay? So the question then is how, this is more or less the problem you have, how to go from here to here without knowing where exactly the Bayesian of attraction is. The only thing you have to orient yourself is the equations of motion that give you local information. Okay? Differential equations always give you only local information. So here is a place where I should say that even though we like to write, to display networks with figures like this one, when you want to study dynamics, it is always more convenient to go to the state space, because that's where the meaningful information is. So in the state space, the situation describes the one in which if you are in a certain state x0, and if you don't do anything, you go to an undesirable state xu, you'd like to perturb the system, bring yourself to another state here that would eventually bring you to the desired target. That will only be possible under the constraints imposed. Let's say that we can only perturb these three nodes, and let's say that I can only reduce the value of those variables. It will only be possible if that feasible region of control interventions will intersect the Bayesian of attraction of my desired state. One way to do that is by using what we call forecast-based. You forecast the trajectory of your system. You look for the closest approach point to the target. You see what direction you should move when you are closest to the target. You map that back to the place you are in right now, and you make that move. And then you repeat this process. Okay? If you repeat this process many times, you are going to build a finite size intervention that is feasible, and that will eventually cross the Bayesian of attraction, even though you didn't know where the Bayesian of attraction was. Okay? So what is it useful for? This can be used to, for example, identify targets for drugs. The example I have here is for a type of cancer. This is a signaling network that controls cell death in a type of red blood cells. The network was built by Rick Albert and her collaborators at Penn State. And it has been validated experimentally, so it's a convenient network. And in this network, the cancer state and the healthy state, they are both represented by attractors, two different attractors. So if you find yourself in the cancer state, what you'd like to do is to bring yourself to the health state, which would be apoptosis here. So people have tried in the past to identify individual targets by knocking out completely individual genes, and by doing so, they identified 19 candidates, which were later, some of them later tested and rejected, others tested and found to be somewhat promising. So people have been studying the ones that are marked gray here. We asked ourselves whether we could go beyond those by considering more general perturbations that would involve multiple targets. And those are the ones colored. And the answer is yes. In general, with an average of about of 3 of them, we can have many more targets that are promising. One of the things that follow here that I think is interesting is that what I'm showing, let me first say that what I'm showing here in the bottom panel is the average intervention for each one of those elements in the network. Okay, some of them are being increased, others are being decreased. And the interesting thing is that even for the genes that or the nodes that are inactive in the cancer state, sometimes the intervention, the optimal intervention to get to the cancer state, involves further increasing their activity. So it's like if you want to cure a disease, but first you have to make the cells a little bit sicker to only then go to the health state. Why is that? That's because these basins of attractions, they are non-local, okay? And nonlinearity comes into play here. Sometimes you have to move in one direction to eventually go to the right one, okay? In which this is relevant is in the case of ecosystem management. If you lose a species in an ecosystem, that's bad by itself, but can be worse because it is now believed that most extinctions that happened in this planet, they happened because they were secondary to primary extinction. So a species is extinct and changes the balance in the food web, and then other species eventually go extinct. That is to say that we have what we call an extinction cascade. So suppose that you have a perturbation, which could be an extinction. What can you do to prevent secondary ones? This is an example of an aquatic food web in which each node represents a species, and the size of the nodes is indicating how likely the removal of that species is to cause a cascade in this network. And the color indicates how likely it is that the removal of that species is going to reduce the size of one such cascade. Okay, so the scenario that you should have in mind here is that the network has been perturbed and a cascade was triggered. And then you ask the question of whether you could mitigate the cascade by removing other species, okay? And, well, that's in general possible. But one thing that is interesting when you look at this network is that from the structure of the network alone, you cannot tell apart the nodes that are more likely to trigger cascade from the ones that are more likely to mitigate cascades. They are actually sometimes neighbors or have more or less the same trophic level. So it's another indication that the structure of the network alone can tell you very little about what's going on, okay? But the conclusion is, in general, food webs to respond in a suboptimal way to perturbation, they tend to go to states that are far from the best ones they could go to, okay, in terms of biomass preservation, okay? Biodiversity preservation, sorry. So, just to complete these examples, if you go back to infrastructure networks, one of the problems there is to keep the generators of the power grid all synchronized. Here in the US, they have to be at 60 hertz in order to be for the power grid to operate. North America and Canada too, that is done through controllers and a number of other things, including the structure of the network itself that helps that state to be kept stable. But if you perturb the network, you can lose that stability, and the system can then deviate from the stable state. A naive approach would be you bring it back to the frequency that it was in before. Assume for a second that that's possible. It's not possible in reality, but let's assume that that is possible. Even if it were, if you could do that, that would not solve the problem because the state is now unstable. It will just go away. Okay. So the right way to address this problem is again to look for the basin. First, to look for the stable state, and then try to put yourself inside the basin of attraction of that state. And if you do that, you then reach a new state that's not exactly the same frequency as the original one, but is still a frequency at which the system can operate. Okay. Getting closer a little bit to the topic of this workshop, I want to give you an example of an associative memory network. This is a network in which we have, it's an 8x8 network of phase oscillators. They can be in two states when they reach their stable configuration. So you can assume them to be on or off. So we use this network to code the 7 letters of the word network. Okay. So the pixels that are on correspond to the state on of the oscillators, and the ones that are off to the state off of the oscillators. So the question we asked was whether you could go from one to the next letter here by using a constrained perturbation like the ones we use for control. So let's assume that we can only perturb the pixels that are off. If you do that, the optimal perturbation would be one that would bring you to this state, which still looks more like N than E, but it eventually converges to E. Okay? And if you do the same here, you get this, and again, looks more like E, but goes to T, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, so this is an example that's meant to be visual. If you look at these gray parts here, those are errors. In fact, it didn't go quite to E. It actually reached a parasite attractor that's close to E, has an extra pixel that's on. But despite those small errors, you can certainly read the word network here. You can certainly recognize what was meant to be the letter in each case. So this tells us that this approach is robust with respect to the target. Even when it misses the target, if the system is multi-stable, it's likely to go to an attractor that has properties close to the one to the attractor that you are trying to reach. Okay. It also scales very well with the network size, I should have mentioned, and it's robust to noise and parameter uncertainty. So it's in that sense. Now, talking about associative memory, when I started working on networks, one of the first things that I looked at was networks of words. And at the time, my motivation was that I thought that maybe the way in which we associate words would be somehow related to the way in which we actually retrieve information and access that information in our own brain. So at the time, I was thinking about association by meaning, like, for example, in a Zoro's dictionary. So you have, for example, words that share meaning, like universe and nature, and you then connect them in your network representation. And this would lead to a network in which you could perhaps think of navigating through using these meanings. Okay, that's one of the many dimensions, of course, of word network. You could think that maybe there are other things that associate words, like their length or phonetics, or perhaps the context in which you learned them, and so on and so forth. Okay? So I see some relation between the discussion that I was having with you here on the control part with natural language. And I want to bring that one step further and comment on this more recent now work with colleagues from Northwestern. Now Eduardo Altman is at Max Planck Institute in Dresden, where we asked the following question. Well, there are lots of things that humans do that appear to be done in bursts, okay? There is one occurrence of that thing and then many in sequence. For example, the way in which people send emails, okay? Sit in front of the computer, you send one, you send many, okay? And then there is a long interval until you send emails again, and so on and so forth. Language is likely to reflect these human activities. So it would be interesting, therefore, to study how people use words. We then turn to the question of the recurrence between successive uses of the same word. And one interesting thing that we discovered at the time was that words too are used in a burst way. So here are two examples. the word theory, the word also, okay? And here is for comparison Poisson distribution for the same number of occurrences. So you can see that you have many more gaps here. If you try to understand this statistically, these are not power laws, but they are more skewed than Poisson distribution. They are actually very well fitted by stretched exponentials. And exponentials will be more steep, therefore closer to be a power law if the word is a word of a class that is more concrete, like keywords, something that have meanings that are more unique. And it will be closer to a Poissonian distribution if it is a more generic word that can have more abstract meanings, like, for example, also, the, things like that. Okay. You might ask how this is modeled. It is one way to describe this is by a model in which you assume that when you do use the word, the probability of using it again goes very high and then decays in time until you use it again and then resets high again, okay? Okay, so the longer it takes for you to use, since last time you use, the smaller is going to be the probability that you are going to use it again, okay? The specific way in which this distribution decays is a power law, okay? Very well described by data from many different sources. For example, the data I'm showing you is here for a set of 200 million words from Usenet, but the same was true, for example, for a debate between McCain and Obama, okay? And so then, what's the relation between this and the network thing that I was talking about earlier? I think some of the methods that we have developed to control cascades in networks, particularly the ones I was discussing here earlier, they could be used to influence this type of dynamics, because as soon as you influence the first event in a burst, you influence the entire burst, okay? Precisely because you are resetting that probability, okay? I could go on and give another talk entirely on this, but I will stop here and with one final comment that perhaps will be more useful for the discussion this afternoon. What I believe to be the role of networks in this, I mean, natural sciences as the usual ones, physics, chemistry, and biology. If you ask a physicist, and I happen to be one, they tend to think that physics is more fundamental than the others because if you understand everything about physics, then you should be able to, in principle, understand everything about chemistry, and in principle, understand everything about biology. There are several problems with that line of thought, but there is people tend to think that way. There was a time when people like Laplace, for example, and if I knew that I would use this quote here, I could have brought it in French. He thought that, he and others thought that, well, as soon as the laws of Newton and thermodynamics and other classical relevant things to describe the world were understood, everything was understood, okay? So here is a passage in which he describes our ability to predict the future as soon as we would have enough resource to process all the information about the universe. This failed for a reason that has little to do with networks, is because of chaos. But still, I don't want to use this to discuss determinism. This has a little bit to do also with the reductionism, depending on how you look at this. Because in my view, the reason it's so difficult to go, even though some would like to believe that if this, then this, and if this, then this, is precisely because of networks. As you go from one scale to the next, networks come into play, and that adds a new dimension to the problem. Chemistry, in particular, if you think, I mean, the difference between materials is not physics. I mean, the physics describing graphite and diamond is the same, and the atoms involved are the same, but the network is not. and that changes a lot the properties of these materials. Okay, so I would just stop here. Of course, things become more complicated when we go entities that think, but I would just stop here and say that there are lots of ways to study networks. Structural properties of networks have been studied by many people, but one thing that hasn't been studied much is the dynamical property, and by that I mean properties that depend on, really have to be described in terms of phase space. Okay, and that's what we were doing here to control networks. Okay. To a large extent, what we are trying to do is just try to find network solutions to network problems. Okay, that seems trivial, but it's not always what is done in the study of networks. Sometimes people are trying to reduce the problem. Okay, just to thank my sponsors, I will leave this last slide here. Thank you very much.